Ever since the early Roman times, flight has always been something mankind has dreamt about. The ancient Greeks would see birds fly and wonder, why can't we fly too? They would investigate this phenomenon to the extent that they would make a whole myth about it. In the beginning, it wasn't just the Greeks who were fascinated by flight, as a Chinese emperor tried to reach the moon by putting hundreds and hundreds of fireworks underneath his throne. We all know that will not go well. The principle of flight itself is very simple. Birds do it, so how hard could it be? Well, the simple action that a bird does turned out to need hundreds and hundreds of years through countless different scientists, researchers, and inventors to finally become a reality for humans. Now, you might know who finally developed the plane, but not many people know about the others who slowly helped the principle and idea of a plane to take form throughout the years. Who first documented flight? Who made the first plausible sketches of a plane? What were some attempts before the Wright Brothers, and why did they not work? How did the Wright Brothers finally make their first airplane? These are all questions that we will answer in today's episode of The History of Something. Today's episode will be divided into 4 parts as usual. The first part will be about the early days and their visions of flight and some ideas that they might have had. The second part will be covering the medieval period, mainly Da Vinci. The third part will be covering the golden age of science from the 1700s to the 1900s and what really played into making a plane. And the last part will be about the famous Wright brothers and their final push to create the airplane. This is not inspired by the value tales. However, I highly recommend that you read the series. But enough of this introduction, let's jump right into the twisting story of flight. The Greeks were like no other ancient civilization in Europe. They were curious about everything and how it worked. Often, to represent these questions and curiosities, they would model them in the form of myths. The myth of Icarus is about a father and a son who are stranded on Crete, which is a Greek island, and they have to use wax wings to fly out. I won't get into the specifications of the myth in today's episode, but for our purposes, this is the first account that we have of the conception of flight. For the next couple hundred years, many myths will continue to form, such as the myth of King Kajuz using eagles to fly around his kingdom, and Pushpak Viman in the epic Mahabharata, which was basically a flying chariot. However, no serious attempt will be made until we come back to the Chinese in the year 400 AD. The Chinese had been experimenting with kites for many years, making them in all different shapes and sizes, and these were really the first steps into making something that could fly. Some of them were used for religious ceremonies like the Chinese New Year, and others were used for the weather. These served as the forerunners to balloons and gliders, 2 inventions that would take the next eon by storm. While the Chinese were the first to make kites, or something that glided, they were still relying on nature to provide the energy and direction to power any possible methods of flight. The Greeks were the first to address this and solve this problem partially years before. Hero of Alexandria was like no other. He was a mathematician and an engineer, something that was relatively rare in the times of the Greeks. He is most famous for his invention, the Alophila, and the Heron's formula, a neat trick for calculating the areas of triangles. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly was the Alophila? Well, it was a contraption that harnessed the power of steam, an idea that was hundreds of years ahead of its time. So the Alophila consisted of 2 L-shaped arms connected to a ball that had boiling water in it. The steam would get released into the 2 L-shaped arms and provide angular momentum, which is basically a form of rotation. Unfortunately, for the next couple hundred years, there will be little scientific progress made anywhere due to a number of factors such as the strict church, religious battles, and the Black Death. The next time flight is revisited is with the great Da Vinci nearly 1,000 years later. Most of us know Leonardo da Vinci because of his artwork, primarily the Mona Lisa. However, he has explored almost every corner of humanity.
I was one of the most curious people of my time. I love to identify and explore many tangential topics such as optics, anatomy, astronomy, and mechanics. When I was trying to build my version of the airplane, the only thing I had to model it with were birds. That's why I made the ornithopter.
This ornithopter was something that was hundreds of years ahead of its time. Da Vinci had taken the painstaking time to analyze the bone and muscle structures of birds and proceed to draw intricate drawings of the possible ornithopter that was based off of these. As we can see in the diagram, it would work by having the person flap the two big wings with his arms, and Da Vinci had been smart enough to make sure to give the ornithopter a backbone to make sure that it was stable, which is a vital concept that we will revisit in 400 years. Da Vinci was not really able to test out his ornithopter, and it just remained an idea in his diary. Nevertheless, it was a massive stride in the history of aviation, and these developments would go on to help future inventors for ages. Part 3. The Golden Ages. There are two main components to make something fly. You first need the apparatus that is required to make it, and the second is a power source. Up until this point in time, the only controllable power source that was being used was the human muscle. However, in the year 1680, everything would change.
Not many people know about me, or what I did, but today I am known as the father of biomechanics, the study of biology and the study of mechanics.
In his famous work on the movement of animals, he talks about how the muscular system of birds and how they're able to fly with them, but most importantly, he linked them to humans. He made it very clear that humans would not be able to fly through their own power, and I quote, "It is impossible that men should be able to craftily fly by their own strength," on the movement of animals. This quote would mean that humanity would have to find another source of power to fly. Fast forward 100 years, 500 miles to the north in Paris, a new way of flying was taking form. Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier was a French inventor and a chemist who first discovered and made hot air balloons. He realized that he could heat up air and then it would rise, coming from the principle that we know that hot air rises. He realized that he could use this advantage, and thus he made the first version of a hot air balloon. This was monumentally important for two reasons. Firstly, it was the first time someone had actually been in the air for this sustained period of time, and the second was that he used an energy source that was different than the human's body, going off of Borelli's works. Unfortunately, after a couple of flights, the balloon exploded mid-flight and he died. The hot air balloon race was quite strong, and in 1785, Jean-Pierre Blachand became the first person to cross the English Channel in this hot air balloon. For the next decade, hot air balloons would be the only thing that would allow people to fly. However, in the year 1483, something would happen that would change the game forever.
I am William Henson, and since Da Vinci, I was the first one to redesign plane ideas. And this time, I used steam as the power source, and I devised it kind of off of a flying carriage. Obviously, as we can tell now, this plan or design did not really work well for obvious reasons. However, there was work that was being done that would be instrumental to the development of the plane.
Meet Samuel Langley. Some of you know his name after the Langley Space Center, which is a namesake. But this man was one of the key players in the design of the modern airplane.
I am the first pioneer to start working with heavier-than-air aircraft. I tried to perfect the equations of lift and drag, which are two principal forces of flight. Langley tried to design planes, but unfortunately for him, his planes were too heavy and required too much power to fly, as he was only able to be successful with small gliders or models of his planes.
A key mistake that many of these inventors were making is that they would first have an engine that was pretty heavy, and then they would have to design a whole aircraft that would be able to sustain the weight of the engine, something that the Wright brothers did in reverse. After Langley, one man was the inspiration of the Wright brothers was Otto Lilienthal. Otto Lilienthal was a pioneer who developed the idea of the wings of a plane that the Wright brothers would go on to use. Otto Lilienthal made countless and countless of flights with gliders, and most notably the ornithopter, as we talked about earlier with Da Vinci. It turned out to be a pretty successful glider, however he was not able to make it into a plane. Finally, we come out the Wright brothers. These are the brothers who finally made the airplane. Orville and Wilbur Wright were born in the years 1871 and 1876, respectively, in Dayton, Ohio. There were 2 out of the 7 siblings that their parents had. His father had a position in the church as a bishop, and that meant that they had to move from town to town a lot. One day after a trip, their father brought home a flying device kind of resembling a helicopter. It was made of bamboo and paper and would be able to fly a couple of feet in the air, and then it would come crashing down. Later on in their memoir, the Wright brothers would explain that this sparked their interest in flying. That isn't to really say that they weren't interested in mechanics whatsoever before, as they loved to tinker, break apart items, and try and put them back together. They had a natural curiosity to fix things and improve them, and that is something that would come very handy later on in their career. Both Orville and Wilbur didn't finish high school, as they both dropped out to make a printing shop, connecting back to their interest in mechanics. Later, they became a repair shop for all sorts of devices, mainly bicycles, because of the bicycle craze running from the year 1892 to 1897. The death of Otto led to their heavy interest in flight. Until now, they were only tinkering with possible wing designs and stuff like that, but his death really made them want to create an airplane. They first wanted to do their research, and they contacted the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and from there, they withdrew many ideas and sketches from people that we've already talked about in the episode: Da Vinci, Langley, and Otto.
You know, Orville, I think that there's something inherently wrong about how people were going about creating or trying to create a plane.
Yeah, I agree, Wilbur. For the past decade, people have built engines and then modeled the plane around that.
I think we should try and do the opposite, Orville. We should make a great glider and then attach a lightweight engine to make sure it is all balanced and it is not too heavy for it to fall.
Their first step was to identify what a bird does in flight, as many people before them had.
You know, Orville, I realized that birds change the angle of their wings to turn from side to side. We should try and reflect these in our principles of our wings and gliders.
So how can they model the system of wing warping? So what they first did was they made a rectangular prism structure made out of bamboo and lightweight cloth. What they would then do is they would take the ends of that and they would kind of twist them in opposite directions, which would cause it to have torque, basically rotate in different directions. They wanted to make sure that this would also happen in the air and that their glider or plane would go in different directions. And they tested this in a wind canal. A wind canal basically is a big canal with a fan on one end blowing wind and the kind of test subject over here. They would put their warped wing over here and they'd have their fan blowing out wind, and they would see how these warped wings caused the glider to go left or right. They knew that their plane was able to demonstrate all types of lateral control, going left to right. Now, the Wright brothers needed a viable location to start making their gliders and training in them. The brothers settled in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to do their aviation-related activities due to two reasons. Firstly, the steady breeze that was present and the soft sand that their gliders and planes could land in. I think we should add the curve to our double-decker design of the glider to make it safer for us and easier to control.
Sure, Orville. I think that is a great idea. However, I do not want you to get hurt, and I will do the gliding for the first couple of years.
Their first couple of glides were all similar in the flight map. They would range from 5 seconds all the way to 26. And usually they would cover around 500 feet. Some of the problems that they had were that the plane was not going as high as they imagined, and they later realized the lift equation that they had gotten from Langley was slightly incorrect and required modifications based on the location that these tests were taking place. Most importantly, however, they were able to turn the plane continuously and with ease. This was something that had not been done before. They were able to perfect the 3 axes of movement: wing warping for a roll, a forward elevator for pitch, and a rear rudder for yaw. Their 1902 glider was the final glider that they would use, and all they had to do was to power it. Many hundreds of years ago, Giovanni Borelli had decided that humans were not able to power a flying machine by themselves, which is why the Wright brothers had to create some engine. Their original plan was to buy an off-the-market engine. However, there were 2 major problems. The first was that they were way too expensive for the Wright brothers. You have to realize that the Wright brothers did not get any government grants or any money outside of the ones that they made at their printing shop due to the secrecy that they kept this. And the second reason, and more importantly, was that all the commercial engines were too heavy for their plane. If they would have chosen a commercial engine, they would have been like all the others before them, making a big plane that had potential but was simply too heavy to fly. This is the part where their history of being tinkerers comes in. They decided, along with their longtime friend Charlie Taylor, who was currently the head mechanic in their printing and repair shop, that all 3 of them would make it by themselves. In just 6 weeks, they were able to make a 12 horsepower engine to power their airplane. At this point, they finally had all the parts they needed to make their plane, and all they had to do was put them together. Finally, on December 17th, 1903, the first heavier-than-air flight was accomplished. This monumental achievement that had been, in total, of 500 years in the making, had finally been achieved. It was not only a great achievement for the Wright brothers, but for all of those who had come before them. Flight has added a whole other dimension to the way that we can communicate with people around the world. And it is important to realize that this would not have been possible without the invention of the Wright brothers. The plane will continue to be an integral part of traveling, communications, and transport for the next thousands of years. It is important to realize that not only the Wright brothers contributed to making the airplane, but there were countless of different scientists that I did not get a chance to mention in today's episode that also played a significant role in the development of this majestic flying beast. I would like to end this episode off with a special note to all the young people who are watching this out there, to say that each small step that you can make in your own life can lead to something big, just like the scientists before the Wright brothers. And with that, I would like to conclude this month's episode of The History of Something.